Kia ora team, welcome to week 4. This week we're going to jump into the digestive system, and we're also going to look at the different energy systems that we use to regenerate ATP, which is our energy currency of the body. If we look at the structure and functions of our digestive system, it breaks down food that we eat into nutrients that we need for metabolic processes, mainly for making ATP. But it also gets rid of materials that can no longer be used by the body, such as fiber. How we do that? Chewing breaks down small food into particles that are easily digestible, for enzymes to break down, for mechanical breakdown. Then these nutrients are actively transported by our blood and delivered to cells around the body. The digestive system is essential for providing the body with the energy that it needs, and the building blocks that it requires to maintain life, which, as we know, is the primary function of our body, is to maintain life. So we can summarize all of that into digestive system providing the processes to break down food into a state that is easily used by the body. So think of it as like a disassembly line that begins at the mouth and ends at the anus. Through that process, food is broken down chemically, mechanically, stripped of what the body needs, and then everything that it doesn't need is gotten rid of. Really basically, ingestion is the food and drink that we take in. Digestion is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food. Absorption is moving from the digestive system into the bloodstream. So that's all of the broken down nutrients that our body needs going from our digestive system, moving across cell membranes into our bloodstream and then transported around. And then finally, defecation, which is the removable of indigestible or unabsorbed material from the body. So our food provides nutrients. They are the substances that the body needs to grow, to maintain life and to maintain function, and for repair. Nutrients include our 3 macronutrients, which provide us with energy: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But we also have vitamins and minerals, which assist all the metabolic functions of the body, but don't directly provide us with energy. And then water. This diagram shows the digestion process of breaking down food into nutrients and what those small pieces of fats, carbs, and proteins look like. So triglycerides are 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. I think of it as looking like this. Remember our phospholipids that make up the cell membrane? I said look like this. So they have 2 fatty acids to a glycerol, whereas a triglyceride looks like that. Our body breaks those down into individual fatty acids plus the glycerol, and that can be used to store energy or to be broken down into producing energy. Carbohydrates are stripped down into single glucose molecules, which we will look at in a bit more detail, as those glucose molecules are our body's easiest way of regenerating ATP. And then lastly, we have proteins, which a protein is made up of a series of different amino acids. There's like 20 different amino acids. The body breaks down those proteins into smaller amino acids, which can then be rebuilt into different tissues that require proteins. Looks very complicated. Fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose. Proteins are broken down into amino acids. So if we look at the digestive tract, or the alimentary canal, it's a long muscular tube that extends from the mouth through the body and ends at the anus. So you've got an entry point and an exit point. It's effectively like one long big hydroslide, which has a whole lot of functions which happen in between. So food passes through the mouth and then through the pharynx, which is actually a shared space of air and food, then down into the esophagus, the stomach, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, anus. So food follows that directional path, a one-way trip. Mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, anus. Knowing these structures and being able to label them and know which order food passes is important. We also have a whole lot of accessory organs. So if you think about any kind of accessory to anything, it means something that assists the main structure or complements something else. So these organs are glands which secrete substances into the lumen of the GI tract. Lumen is a technical word for the round space of a tube. So you have a lumen inside blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and the lumen of your digestive tract. And these secretions aid digestion. So we got salivary glands, which start in the mouth, your tongue, your teeth, your liver, your gallbladder, and your pancreas. So in the oral canal, we have our salivary glands, tongue, and teeth. Liver is a super big organ. It has multiple functions. We'll look at specific digestion functions today. Gallbladder and the pancreas. Remembering that these are all accessory organs to the ones we looked at on the previous slide. Mouth is a space for mechanical and chemical breakdown. Food is chewed, mixed with saliva to form bolus, and bolus is just a flash word for food that is swallowed. It's propelled down the esophagus towards the stomach via a process called peristalsis, and we'll look at that soon. Saliva contains digestive enzymes. Those enzymes are salivary amylase and lingual lipase, and they are chemicals that help chemically pull apart food molecules into smaller ones. They start the chemical breakdown of carbohydrates and fats at the mouth. And you'll notice what happens when you're hungry and you see food being prepared is that process actually starts before you put food into your mouth. An enzyme is a protein that acts as a catalyst in chemical reactions. A catalyst is something that speeds up a reaction but doesn't become a part of the reaction. It stays the same. Your pharynx is a muscular tube that extends from the oral cavity or your mouth to your esophagus, so it's in between those spaces. It transports the bolus and liquids during swallowing. It's a shared food and breathing space, meaning when you breathe in and when you swallow food, both of those gases and the swallowed substances pass through your pharynx. So here you can see in this diagram, the green represents the bolus, and it is being swallowed and is moving through the shared pharynx. Peristalsis is a term that describes wave-like muscular contractions that run the length of the digestive tract. So it happens the whole way through, and it starts with swallowing. So the process of swallowing begins peristalsis, moving bolus through the digestive tract. The esophagus is a muscular tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach, secretes mucus to help transport a food, and is located posterior to the trachea. So remembering posterior describes position that's further towards the back. Your trachea, which is your breathing pipe, is in front or anterior to your esophagus. Stomach, it looks like a J, a sac-like organ located between esophagus and small intestines. It's essentially just a large piece of that digestive tract. In this space, food is churned by the stomach and mixes digestive gastric juices. So it secretes gastric juices. These are a blend of enzymes and acids. The acid is hydrochloric acid, very acidic, and it helps food become like the semi-liquid substance called chyme, but it's also a harsh environment for things like bacteria, which means you can eat that slightly slimy ham out of the fridge and potentially not get sick because of that harsh acidic environment in your stomach. It kills bacteria or anything that shouldn't be there. The process of moving chyme into the small intestines may take around 4 hours, so your stomach will churn up that substance for around 4 hours. The only substances absorbed by the stomach are water, and not all water, but some water, some minerals, alcohol, and some medications. Small intestines, 3 parts. So there's three components of your small intestines: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. A strategy for remembering those in the order that food passes through them is thinking of DJI, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Their small intestines are about 6 meters long, which is pretty long. And they sort of resemble a string of sausages. Nearly all food absorption happens in the small intestines. So this is where absorption from your digestive tract into your blood system happens. So we're looking at absorption of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and all the minerals that are associated with any of that absorption. This is a zoomed up version of what the walls look like in your small intestines. Remember, we looked at cell walls and different structures of cell walls. Your small intestines have a whole lot of microvilli, which are like little finger-like extensions. And what you will see is that this increases the amount of surface area, which increases absorption. So zoomed up in here, you'll see blood vessels inside each little microvilli, which is where you'll have absorption moving from your digestive tract into your blood. And that's how your nutrients get into the whole network of transport that is your cardiovascular system. Another term which is a bit like peristalsis is segmentation. This happens in your small intestines, and they are muscular contractions that move food back and forth to separate and mix the stomach chyme with digestive secretions. So bolus, or the food in the system, gets squeezed by the small intestines, and that splits them up, and then that mixes. So segmentation is all about separating food or chyme, helping the mixture and mechanical breakdown happen even more. Large intestines, we have 5 main parts here: cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon. The ascending, transverse, and descending explain like up, across, down. Cecum is at the start and sigmoid is at the end. You've also got a little finger-like extension that is your appendix. Historically was considered a useless organ, but more sort of recent research has suggested that it actually has a function in maintaining gut microbiome, so bacteria that is good for the system. So if you have a bout of like diarrhea, vomiting, or antibiotics where that system has been disrupted, the appendix helps contribute to reculturing that bacteria. The main role of your large intestines is absorption of water and preparation of feces, so getting rid of what we don't need. It's about 1.5 meters in length, and it frames, which means sits around the small intestines. It's the largest bacterial ecosystem in the human body, and that's our good gut bacteria, and that's where some of the fiber can actually be broken down and metabolized through bacteria that does that breaking down. It's also where things like the bad smells of the digestive system are created because of that bacteria activity. Okay, here's a zoomed up version of what our large intestine looks like. You can see the appendix at the bottom, your cecum, which just is the base of the large intestines. Then you have your ascending colon, your transverse colon, descending colon, and then your sigmoid colon, which is at the bottom. Then you have the rectum and the anal canal, where Mr. Poo comes out at the end. Our liver is pretty amazing. It's the largest internal body organ we have. It has many metabolic functions, but primarily digestive function is to produce bile. So it has lots of functions, but in digestion it produces bile, and bile is a slightly alkaline or base solution that does a couple of things. It helps fats become digestible and mix with water, and it also contributes to neutralizing that strong acidic environment that comes from the stomach. Bile is that yellowy kind of substance that doesn't contain enzymes, but it contains salts. It is produced by the liver, but it's squirted into the digestive system by the gallbladder. So bladder is a term for something that holds liquid. Your urinary system has a bladder also. It doesn't make the urine in your urinary system, but it holds it, just like your gallbladder doesn't make bile. Your liver does, but the gallbladder holds onto your bile and administers that into the small intestines. So just to recap, bile helps to metabolize fats. It acts as an emulsifier, which helps water bind to it. Your pancreatic enzymes are produced by the pancreas and are secreted into the duodenum in an alkaline fluid. Again, so that's saying it's a base type substance which, when mixed with acids, we mix an acid and a base, helps to produce a pH that is a bit more neutral. So the duodenum is the base of the small intestines. This pancreatic enzymes that are released by the pancreas help neutralize the acid from the stomach, and it also helps with the digestion of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So it also has a metabolic function in terms of breaking down those three macronutrients. Bile and our pancreatic juice are squirted into the small intestines together. So in this diagram, you'll see the gallbladder, you'll see the pancreas, which is the yellow thing, and you'll see two tubes come together in one little duct where those bile and pancreatic juice are administered into the small intestines. Just above that small intestine would be the stomach, where that acidic chyme is entering. That has to be neutralized so that your digestive system, in terms of small intestines and large intestines, can handle that acid. Your stomach is lined in mucus to protect it from that acidic environment. And this is just a zoomed up version of those organs. And on the left, you'll see this liver, stomach, and how they sit. This actually makes up the long answer question for this topic. Here is a slide that just helps to summarize everything that is digestion. So on the left are all the digestive organs, so our main digestive tract or GI tract, but then also the accessory organs. And on the right is a summary of food coming in, sites of mechanical digestion, sites of chemical digestion, what's happening in the stomach, some of the muscle contractions that are used to break down food even further, the absorption. So we've got absorption into blood vessels, but the lymphatic vessels actually also absorb fats, and we'll talk about that in the lymphatic system week. What's happening at the small intestines, large intestines, and then defecation at the very end. So if you could speak to this slide, then you understand everything that you need to know for the digestive system. Here is a summary of the physical changes as food moves through the system and the chemical changes, and at different sites. So again, this is a good little study table to be familiar with. Now we're going to move on to energy systems and our body metabolism, and effectively we're looking at three different things: aerobic energy production, anaerobic energy production, and ATP phosphocreatine system. This could be a topic in itself. We could spend 12 weeks on it. Again, we're really going to just touch on the fundamentals of our energy systems and where ATP comes from, knowing that it can be very complicated. So we know about ATP, energy currency of the body. It's what we can spend for energy to be used. Effectively, what we've got going on here is this reversible equation of ATP on the right, which is adenosine, which is the green shapes and the blue shape, and our three phosphate molecules. That's what ATP looks like. Those three phosphates are really high activity, and the third phosphate can be split off quite easily, releasing a whole lot of energy. What that creates is ADP, which is the same structure, just missing one phosphate. What we need to do is to replace that phosphate to regenerate ATP. The thing about energy to understand is that energy is never lost, it's just replaced or changed or moved into a different format. So what's happening is this splitting of phosphate, putting it back on, splitting, putting back on, continuously to allow us to function. It's a reversible reaction, but the energy is different. So when ATP is released, and made into ATP and 1-phosphate, that is the energy that's released for us to do things like contracting our muscles, or the energy that we need for our active transport when nerve cells send messages. But to replace that, to regenerate that ATP, the energy required comes from our energy systems, which fundamentally comes from our macronutrients, from what we eat. So that's where we look at our creatine phosphate system, our anaerobic system, and our aerobic system. Energy released for muscle contractions, functions of the body, and then energy required to replace or restructure ATP so it can be used again. Continual cycle. Our stores of ATP in the body are extremely low, so how much we have actually just hanging around is not a lot, and the role of the energy systems is to rebuild this ATP. This depends on things like how quickly we are asking the body to replace that ATP. If you go for a 1 kilometer time trial run as fast as you can, you are now asking your body to replace ATP quicker. How fast these reactions are happening, what nutrients you have available, so do you have carbs, fats, or proteins available, and is there enough oxygen available to contribute to each reaction? That determines how ATP is rebuilt. Our body can make and replenish ATP in different ways. The three main processes that we're going to look at, or our energy systems, are the ATP PCR system. PCR is phosphocreatine. Phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate. It's a molecule like ATP. We can look at the glycolytic pathway, or the anaerobic energy without oxygen, and the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, which is aerobic energy with oxygen. So just to recap, glycolytic is anaerobic without oxygen, oxidative is aerobic with oxygen. So our creatine phosphate ATP CPR system, we have a storage of phosphocreatine in the muscle, but only enough for a few seconds of intense activity. Phosphocreatine helps us to replenish really quickly ADP into ATP. ADP has a spare phosphate. We can split that off, add it to our ADP, and we have ATP again, but we have limited stores of both ATP that we're using and the creatine phosphate. It's the fastest way to rebuild, produces very small amounts of ATP, and there's no byproducts. So really short bursts of intense activity, we have that system set up to replace and regenerate ATP. Looks like this. On the left, we've got a phosphocreatine or a creatine phosphate molecule, C and a P together. Underneath, we have an adenosine diphosphate, so our ADP. Creatine kinase is a type of enzyme that will help this process happen, where we split off a phosphate from the creatine, and we now have creatine by itself, and we have an ATP remainder. As soon as that creatine phosphate is used up, then we no longer have the ability to regenerate ATP in this fashion. You only have limited stores, so once it's out, and it takes a long time to recover that, so like hours to recover that. Basically, a phosphocreatine can donate a phosphate group to ADP to form ATP again. Anaerobic energy, so without oxygen, is fast at rebuilding ATP through the breakdown of glucose, and this process is called glycolysis, and understanding glycolysis is really important. It does not require oxygen, and it does not require the organelle mitochondria, which we've learnt about in terms of building lots of ATP. This anaerobic energy system produces small amounts of ATP, and it does also produce byproducts including lactate and hydrogen ions, which lead to fatigue. So when ATP is split, when glucose is split to regenerate ATP, it produces byproducts that, if you don't have oxygen available, will build up in the system and will lead to fatigue. And that process is called fermentation. So you have this acidic environment building up in your muscles, which stops you from functioning. Aerobic energy, so now we do have oxygen available, but it's slow at rebuilding ATP. So that's why we need to slow down to produce energy aerobically. This does occur inside the mitochondria, and it does require oxygen. It produces big amounts of ATP. The byproducts of this are probably the byproducts that you're a bit more aware of: carbon dioxide and water. This is a summary of our aerobic energy. So you got a glucose molecule which looks like this. It's got 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. You mix this with 6 oxygen molecules, and that produces carbon dioxide, water, plus energy, or ATP. Here's a bit of a summary of our key equations. So the cellular respiration equation is just our body repackaging ATP back together. And that's that reversible equation. And we've got 3 different systems that will contribute to this reversible equation. Creatine phosphates, our creatine phosphate system. So we got phosphocreatine plus adenine diphosphate makes ATP plus creatine. Then we have our anaerobic energy, which is splitting of glucose. The term is glycolysis, and that produces lactate plus ATP. And our aerobic energy, which is having glucose plus oxygen, produces CO2, H2O, and ATP. These are very basic summary of those key equations. So here we've got a bit of a infograph to help us to work out what's happening and when and under what situation and where. So let's look on the far left. We've got glucose or glycogen. Glycogen is a stored version of glucose which you have in your liver and your muscles. It can be broken down to produce ATP. In that process, ATP is produced, small amounts, but you also produce something called pyruvate. Now, if you have enough oxygen available, so you're not asking your body to produce ATP quickly, that pyruvate, that is a byproduct of glycolysis, moves into the mitochondria of the cell, and your body is able to produce ATP and has a byproduct of CO2 and water. Glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria, so inside the cell, but in the cytoplasm or the cytosol. Then our pyruvate, which is a byproduct of glycolysis, that byproduct moves into the mitochondria with oxygen and other things to produce big amounts of ATP. So let's look on the right hand side. We've got glucose being broken down, or glycogen being broken down. Same thing, we have pyruvate that has been produced as a byproduct of glycolysis. We also have some ATP being produced. Now, if you're asking your body to do this quickly, so it might be running a 400-meter race, for example, there is more and more pyruvate being produced. If you're unable to get enough oxygen in, then that creates an environment where that pyruvate is actually fermented into lactate, which is something that creates an acidic environment. And if you have too much of it, your body will start to decrease in performance, and you will be forced to slow down the intensity of your activity so that the oxygen that you're getting in can catch up with the demand of ATP. So glycogen produces pyruvate without enough O2 because you're exercising so intensely that pyruvate ferments and becomes lactic acid, which we know about. You are still producing ATP, but there is a buildup of that lactic acid in the system, and eventually you will have to slow down. Let's summarize these key points. I know it's confusing. Lots of new terms and concepts that are very microscopic, but glycolysis means the breakdown of glucose. Pyruvate or pyruvic acid is a byproduct of glycolysis, and it's the decision maker. Basically, if you have pyruvate, it decides whether it's going to produce lactic acid or if it's going to go into the mitochondria and produce lots of ATP, and that's dependent on the availability of oxygen. So aerobic metabolism, yes, we have enough oxygen. With that pyruvate, we can create a whole lot of ATP in the mitochondria. Not enough oxygen, we're exercising too intensely, that pyruvate is going to ferment and become lactic acid. Eventually, we'll have to slow down that intensity. Aerobic is with oxygen, occurs in the mitochondria. End products are ATP, CO2, and water. Anaerobic, without oxygen, occurs in the cytosol, outside of the mitochondria, but inside the cell. End products are ATP and lactate, or fermentation. Here's a bit of a visual of our energy systems in action. So we look on the far left, the orange is how much ATP we have already stored, and it's not a lot. You're looking at like 3 to 5 seconds of enough ATP to produce energy. Then your creatine phosphate that is stored in your muscles can contribute to regenerating ATP, but that'll last 10 to 15 seconds. Then you go into your anaerobic glycolysis, which will last anywhere between sort of 30 to 90 seconds. And then in the background, your aerobic system is slowly chipping away at using that pyruvate in the mitochondria with oxygen to produce large amounts of ATP. And then during rest, your body is using fats as its primary source, and that's again takes a lot of time to produce ATP using fat. So generally it's glucose or stored glycogen, but in the background during rest it'll be fat metabolism. And they don't happen in isolation. These systems are happening collectively together, and it depends on the intensity of ATP production as to which system is contributing the most at any one time. I know that was very heavy. Don't panic. Again, same system. Get onto the self-directed task, Quizlet. Don't forget your online quiz. Keep chipping away at the process. Tutorial time, we'll revisit this and some exam prep for next week. Ka pai.